Can silence keep its blade hidden until the very night it chooses to strike? Can the glow of Christmas lanterns, swaying gentle against the frost, mask the shadow of vengeance drawing near? Can a man whose tongue was chained and whose back bore the tally of whips become the very silence that kills? Mississippi, 1818. The house glimmered with festive lights, each lantern trembling in the winter wind like a star caught in glass. Inside, masters feasted, their laughter louder than hymns, their arrogance heavier than prayer, yet outside that golden glow another presence lingered, quiet, patience sharpened by grief, and on that night, beneath lanterns meant to celebrate mercy, Jonah's silence would finally speak in blood. Before we continue deeper into the silence of 1818, pause with me. These are not softened tales, not fables told for comfort. They are echoes carved in pain, whispers that defy time, and truths that history tried to bury beneath its pages. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. The plantation in Mississippi lay wide as a scar against the winter earth. Frost covered the cane fields in a thin skin of silver, each blade stiff and brittle, as though even the ground itself resisted bending further beneath the weight of chains. The air was sharp with December's bite, carrying the smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The great house stood on the hill, swollen and arrogant, its white columns glowing faintly beneath the lanterns hung. They swayed in the wind, their glass throats trembling with trapped fire, their light spilling out in weak halos onto the frozen ground. Every December this house of cruelty dressed itself in celebration. Lanterns dangled from eaves as though stars had been stolen from the sky. Fir branches were pinned above doorways, their needles drying in the warmth, scenting the rooms with pine. Inside, the hearths roared with flames that licked against stone, sparks flying into the rafters like fragments of prayers denied. Silver platters were polished until they blinded the eye, ready to bear roasted meats and candied fruit. Brandy decanters glowed amber in the firelight. The masters filled the rooms with their booming laughter, louder than hymns, louder than the wind that rattled the shutters. Their joy was not joy, but excess, their merriment a cruel display of abundance in a world they had built on hunger. For Jonah, silence was the only garment he could wear. He moved in the background of their pageantry like a shadow bound to their light. Each morning he rose before the sun had clawed its way out of the horizon, his breath misting white in the darkness as he carried wood to feed the house's many fires. His hands were raw, cracked, bleeding from frost and work, his back bent with the rhythm of chains, his body a tool sharpened not by will but by command. The overseer's whistle carried across the fields sharper than the cold itself, a sound Jonah had long ago learned to obey. Day after day his silence was demanded. He said little, for words had long ago been stolen from him, replaced by the whip, the command, the nod of obedience. Yet his silence was not emptiness. It was weight, it was patience, it was the steady filling of a vessel that one day must overflow. The house's grandeur was a constant wound. Jonah entered its rooms not as guest or kin, but as shadow, bearing trays heavy with food he would never taste, pouring wines whose sweetness never touched his tongue. The masters spoke of land and wealth, of trade and politics, their words puffing out like smoke in the warm air. They rarely spoke to Jonah except in command. His existence was invisible except in service. Yet he absorbed everything, the cadence of their voices, the careless cruelty in their tone, the subtle drunken slur of the master when brandy pulled him towards sleep. Each detail was recorded silently, folded away into Jonah's memory as if it were another entry in a hidden ledger only he could read. Christmas in the great house was spectacle, but to the enslaved it was contradiction. They were given token gifts, an old scarf, a tin of molasses, sometimes coins tossed as though to dogs. Songs were sung, but not the songs Jonah remembered from his mother's lips. Hers had been soft, rising from earth and sorrow, carrying memory. Theirs were loud, shallow, booming from the piano keys in the drawing room, and always lanterns burned above them, fragile globes of trembling light, as if mocking the darkness they were never allowed to escape. At night, Jonah returned to the quarters, the frost already creeping into the cracks of the walls. The dirt floor was hard beneath him, his thin blanket barely a shield against the cold. Around him others whispered in fragments, family lost, children sold, the whip's sting fresh on skin. But Jonah did not join in their murmurs. He kept his silence, as though the absence of words was his last possession. Lying there, staring into the darkness, he would hear the faint laughter from the big house, and each echo carved itself deeper into the ledger within him. The seasons themselves seemed to conspire. The fields groaned beneath frost, the trees cracked in the cold. The very timbers of the house moaned as if burdened with secrets too heavy to bear. The shutters clattered like bones in the night wind. Floorboards whispered under every step. Even the lanterns outside, swaying against the black sky, seemed restless, trapped flames straining to escape their glass cages. Jonah lived in that silence, within that breathing house. Every humiliation, every whip mark, every command added another weight to his chest. But he carried them without sound, without complaint. His silence was not surrender, it was survival. It was patience. It was the sharp edge of waiting, honed with every passing day. And so the house dressed itself in finery, the masters in velvet, the tables in silver, while Jonah carried his silence through each room like a shadow bound to their light. He polished their knives, poured their brandy, laid their fires. He absorbed their laughter, their insults, their careless cruelties, and all the while the ledger inside him swelled heavier, thicker, nearing the moment when silence itself would demand to be heard. The winter of 1818 was colder than most. The frost clung stubborn to the fields. The stars burned sharper in the sky, and the lanterns above the veranda swayed violently in the wind, as though warning of something yet to come. Jonah stood beneath them one night, looking up at the trembling glass, the light spilling weakly onto his skin. He said nothing. He only listened to the wind, to the groaning of the house, to the silence inside him sharpening into Jonah's silence was not emptiness, it was a book being written in secret, line by line, page by page. Every lash of the whip, every insult spat across the dining hall. Every night he went hungry while laughter roared in the master's house. These were his entries, not ink on paper but scars on skin, memories pressed into bone. His life had become a ledger of debts owed, each one waiting to... He remembered his mother's voice most of all. She had sung softly at night, her hymns stitched together from fragments of hope, words half remembered from a homeland Jonah had never seen. She had told him silence was not weakness, but armor. "They cannot steal what you do not give," she whispered once, brushing her rough hands across his cheek. Yet even she could not withstand the weight of the whip forever. She had died too soon, body broken beneath toil and punishment, her song silenced mid-breath. That silence became Jonah's inheritance, his first entry in the ledger. His father was nothing more than a shadow, taken before Jonah could remember. Some said he had been sold, others claimed he had fled into the night. Jonah had grown up with that absence like a wound that never closed. It was the second entry, the second debt recorded in silence. His sisters had been taken too, sold away one by one. Their cries had echoed in Jonah's ears long after their footsteps vanished. He never saw them again. The ledger grew heavy with their absence. The scars on Jonah's back were the ledger's pages. Each welt raised from his skin hardened into memory. The overseer had once called them marks of discipline, but to Jonah they were accounts, tallies of cruelty, each demanding repayment. He never forgot their sting, the way his body arched under the leather's bite, the smell of his own blood mingling with dust. Each scar was a number written into the silence, carved where no one could erase it. But Jonah's silence was not only grief, it was patience. He watched when others looked away. He learned the rhythms of the house, the exact moment when the master's boots dragged with drunken weight, the sound the staircase made on its 7th step, the jingle of keys left too carelessly at night. He carried these details like secret entries in his ledger. Nothing was wasted. Even humiliation became fuel. He remembered the laughter at his expense, the jokes told as though he were invisible, the moments when he was made to kneel in front of guests, treated as both property and entertainment. Each of these moments he folded into the silence, into the ledger that swelled behind his stillness. At night, when the cabin walls rattled with the wind and the dirt floor pressed against his bones, Jonah would close his eyes and recite the ledger silently. His mother's absence, his father's shadow, his sister's cries, his scars, his hunger, his humiliation, his silence. Over and over he counted them, like a priest reciting prayers, like an accountant balancing debts. He whispered them not with words but with breath, with memory, with rage that did not burn outward but folded inward, sharpening into something harder than steel. The master never suspected. To him Jonah was docile, obedient, beaten into compliance. He saw the bowed head, the lowered eyes, the hands that served without complaint. He did not see the silence, did not hear the ledger being written in the dark. He mistook quiet for defeat, patience for emptiness. He mistook Jonah's shadow for submission. But Jonah knew better. Silence was not surrender. It was waiting. It was the frost that builds unseen until it cracks the strongest tree. It was the river that carves stones slowly, silently, until the rock collapses. Silence was survival, and silence was a weapon. Sometimes when he stood in the dining hall, Jonah imagined the weight of the knife in his hand, imagined the way silence could shatter into sound. He never moved, never betrayed himself, but in his chest the ledger pulsed, page after page, waiting for its ink. He could feel history gathering within him, as though his very body was no longer flesh, but record, a book that demanded to be balanced. And so the days dragged on, each one another entry. Frost clung to the windows of the big house, lanterns swayed above the veranda, laughter spilled into the night. Jonah poured wine, carried platters, stoked fires. His silence remained unbroken, his face unreadable, but inside the ledger of pain grew heavier, fuller, nearing the point where silence could no longer hold its weight. The winter of 1818 pressed down with unusual cruelty. The nights were longer, the frost sharper, the house more restless in its groaning. Jonah felt it in his bones, not just the season but the closing of a cycle. Silence had carried him this far, but silence, he knew, must one day speak. The ledger had been written too long, the debts too many, and beneath the swaying Christmas lanterns, trembling against the cold, Jonah began to sense that the night was near when the ledger would be settled in red. Winter thickened its grip on Mississippi, the fields frozen into silence. Each morning the frost lay heavy, each evening the lanterns trembled in the wind. To most these were ordinary rhythms of the season, but to Jonah they were signals, reminders, omens. The ledger of his pain had grown too heavy, and the silence within him had begun to shift from endurance into intention. Revenge did not come to Jonah in a sudden blaze. It crept in softly, almost tender, like frost climbing a window pane. It arrived not as fire, but as study. He began to see the plantation not as a prison, but as an armory, its smallest details holding the potential of weapons. The kitchen knives were the first to whisper to him. He polished them as he always did, rubbing the blades until they gleamed against the light. But where others saw tools for carving meat, Jonah saw the sharp possibility of freedom. He measured their weight in his palm, the balance of steel against bone. He cleaned them slower now, not out of laziness but reverence, as though each knife was an altarpiece waiting for its true purpose. Chains were no longer only bonds. Jonah studied their locks, the way the iron curled into teeth, the weak points where age had worn them smooth. He listened to the sound of them clattering when the overseer walked by, memorized their language. What had bound him might one day bind another. Fire, too, became part of his planning. Each night he stacked logs into the great hearth, watching how flames devoured wood in patterns. He saw how sparks leapt when air fed them, how smoke curled when damp bark resisted. To others it was simple fire. To Jonah it was proof of how swiftly a house might betray its master when given flame. Even thread and needle, so delicate in the mistress's hands, became symbols to him. He watched the way fabric surrendered to the prick of the needle, how seams pulled tight under thread. He held one once, thin as a whisper, and felt its power in miniature. Thread could bind wrists, needles could puncture more than cloth. Lanterns, most of all, haunted his thoughts. Hung high along the veranda, swaying in the cold wind, they seemed both fragile and eternal. Their flames trembled inside fragile glass, cages of light that could shatter at the smallest touch. Jonah would look at them each night, listening to their subtle rattle in the wind, and see more than light. He saw judgment, he saw witnesses, he saw stars captured and waiting to fall. Every task he performed became rehearsal. Setting the master's goblet down taught him steadiness. Warring wine taught him precision. Walking silently across the groaning boards taught him patience. He memorized every sound the house made, the sigh of the staircase, the creak of the parlor door, the whisper of wind beneath shutters. The house itself seemed to conspire with him, revealing its secrets to his silence. The master's habits, too, became a ritual Jonah observed. He knew the man's footsteps, the way brandy slowed him, the hours when his pride dragged him into solitude. He knew the study's drawers, the placement of its ledgers, the angle of the chair by the fire. Jonah absorbed these details not as servant but as revenge, each observation written into the growing scripture of revenge. He did not speak of it, not even in whispers. Silence had always been his shield, and now it became his forge. In the cabin at night, while others drifted into uneasy sleep, Jonah lay awake with his eyes on the rafters. He would recite the ledger silently, his mother's death, his father's absence, sister's cries, the whip, the laughter, the hunger, the scars. And then he would recite the tools, knife, chain, fire, needle, lantern, like a litany, like scripture, like prophecy. Patience was his ally. He did not rush. He knew vengeance demanded ritual. It demanded the slow sharpening of silence into a blade. He carried on with his duties, bowed his head when ordered, served wine, hauled wood. Outwardly he was unchanged, obedient, quiet, unthreatening. But inside silence was no longer endurance. It was storm. December pressed deeper into its cold, and Christmas drew near. The house swelled with guests, with laughter, with music. The lanterns multiplied, their glow reaching across the veranda like a false constellation. Jonah looked at them as he passed, their flames trembling in glass, and felt the weight of the ledger tipping. He did not know the exact night. Revenge does not always reveal its hour. But he knew it would be soon. He could feel it in the way the wind rattled the shutters, in the way frost painted the windows with patterns like scars. He could feel it in his chest, where silence had carried him for so long. The tools were ready, the house was ready, the ledger was ready, and Jonah himself, sharpened by silence, was ready. The winter of 1818 had become a season of waiting no longer. It had become a season of judgment. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky frozen with stars. The air smelled of pine and smoke, of roasted meat spilling its scent through the wide halls of the great house. Lanterns trembled outside, their flames flickering against the frost, each one a trembling eye. Inside, laughter rattled like chains made of sound, echoing through the dining room, booming against the rafters, louder than hymns, louder than prayers. Jonah moved among them as he always did, silent as shadow. He poured the brandy, refilled goblets, carried platters heavy with roasted goose and sugared apples. His hands did not tremble, his eyes never rose higher than the table. To the masters and their guests he was invisible. To Jonah every step was measured, every moment a heartbeat in the countdown of silence. The master's voice, slurred with wine, rose above the others. He spoke of his wealth, his land, his power over bodies and souls. He called Jonah forward once to fill his cup and laughed at the steadiness of his servant's hand. Jonah bowed, listening, recording each word another stroke in the ledger that was now nearly full. The night grew late, and as always, the master left the hall to retreat into his study. He carried a ledger book with him, swollen with accounts of profit, of names, of debts. His boots dragged slightly on the left heel, the way Jonah had memorized. The fire in the study glowed orange against the windows, shadows twitching like restless ghosts. Jonah followed. He moved as if the house itself carried him, his silence folding into the groans of the floorboards, the hiss of wind against the shutters. He slipped into the study like breath. The master sat slouched in his chair, brandy at his elbow, papers spread before him. His throat, ruddy with drink, gleamed faintly in the firelight. He muttered to himself, figures and accounts, names written in the language of ownership. Jonah watched from the doorway, the glow of the lantern outside spilling weakly through the window, striking across the master's desk like judgment. The knife Jonah carried was not sudden. It had been polished many times under his hand. Tonight it was not steel but scripture, the closing of a book too long in the writing. He stepped forward, and the house seemed to hush. Even the wind stilled for a moment, as though the world itself waited. The master turned, startled, his eyes bleary with drink. His mouth opened, but before sound could escape, Jonah's silence struck. The knife cut across his throat in one steady motion, as smooth as pouring wine into a cup. There was no shout, no scream, only a wet gasp, a broken gurgle. Blood spilled across the desk, soaking the ledgers, blotting numbers into red smears. The fire cracked louder, as if exhaling relief. The lantern outside swayed hard, its glass clattering, light scattering across the walls. The master's body twitched, his hands clawing briefly at the air, then fell limp across his books. His wealth, his power, his pride, all drowned beneath the silence Jonah delivered. For a moment Jonah stood still, the knife in his hand dripping, his breath steady. The house groaned deeply in its bones, as though it too had felt the blade. The lantern outside shattered, glass falling into the snow below, its flame extinguished in a hiss of smoke. The silence that followed was vast. It was not emptiness, but fulfillment. Centuries of patience had spoken in one cut. The ledger was balanced, the silence broken. Jonah turned and vanished into the corridors, his footsteps folding again into the groans of wood, into the whispers of wind. Behind him the master lay slumped, his throat a red ledger across the page of Christmas. The lanterns outside swayed wildly now, their trembling flames like witnesses unable to close their eyes. The house did not awaken with screams, it awakened with whispers. Before dawn, servants crept into the study and found the master slumped forward across his desk, his throat torn open, his face frozen in disbelief. The fire had burned low, the smell of iron heavy in the air. Blood had dried into the pages of his ledgers, figures blurred into crimson stains. The lantern outside the window hung shattered, its glass scattered in the snow, its flame extinguished. They did not cry out, they did not run, they stood in silence, their eyes meeting for only a breath before lowering again. No one said Jonah's name, no one needed to. Silence itself was his shroud. By midday, neighbours arrived, summoned by the mistress's weeping. Her lace handkerchief was soaked through as she wailed of demons, of thieves, of God's wrath come uninvited. She told them her husband had been faithful, that the house had been blessed with prayer, that such a death could only come from beyond. Her words spilled like broken glass, sharp but empty. The overseer's face carried no certainty. He paced the floors with a look that betrayed knowledge he dared not name. He had always known silence was not emptiness but waiting. Now each sound in the house startled him. He flinched at the creak of shutters, at the groan of floorboards, at the hiss of wind through cracks. The memory of Jonah's bowed head haunted him more than any scream could. Rumours spread quickly, carried on the frost and the press. The newspapers wrote their half-truths. A master of Mississippi slain on Christmas Eve, throat cut while his books of account lay open before him. They speculated of robbers, of drifters, of punishment from heaven. None wrote the truth, none dared print the word that lived in silence. Jonah. Among the enslaved, whispers flowed like smoke, too thin to grasp, too heavy to disperse. They did not speak openly, they did not risk betrayal, but in brief glances, in hushed exchanges by the well, in the rhythm of their work songs, the truth carried. Jonah had spoken for them all. The ledger of one had balanced the debts of many. The great house, once swollen with arrogance, became hushed. Guests no longer stayed late into the night. The halls seemed colder, the walls restless, the timbers groaning louder in storms. Lanterns swayed violently in winter winds, their trembling flames feared as omens. Servants avoided the study, claiming they smelled iron there long after it had been scrubbed clean. The mistress clung to her prayers, but her voice faltered in the silence that pressed around her. She covered mirrors in black cloth, muttering of curses, of restless spirits. She forbade the lanterns from being lit in the windows, as though their glow had become guilty eyes. And the neighbours, though they spoke loudly of justice, carried unease in their eyes. Each time the wind rattled shutters or a lantern swayed, they remembered the master found on Christmas Eve. They began to lower their voices at night, as though silence itself had become dangerous. As for Jonah, he was gone. Some claimed he fled north, vanished into the rivers and woods, swallowed by darkness. Others swore he was caught and buried nameless beneath the frost. No proof, no body, no certainty. He was present only in silence. His absence became more powerful than his presence had ever been. And so, whispers replaced facts, and silence replaced testimony. What had been a single act of vengeance became something larger, something untouchable. A story took root in the soil, in the houses, in the breath of those who carried it. Jonah was no longer only a man, he was an echo. The ledger had spoken, the silence had cut, and though the blood was scrubbed from the floorboards, the story could not be erased. Time passed, yet the silence of that night did not fade. It lingered in the timbers of the house, in the frost of the fields, in the way lanterns swayed violently each December, as though still remembering the moment their glass first shattered. Travellers spoke of the estate in hushed tones. They said Christmas there was cursed, that lanterns refused to burn steady, that a draught colder than the season itself clung to the study where the master had died. Some swore they saw a figure in the fields on winter nights, tall, silent, unmoving, watching with eyes the wind could not extinguish. None dared approach, none dared speak his name. Among the enslaved, the story became more than memory. It was told in fragments, never fully spoken, always wrapped in silence. A hymn sung low would falter on one line, and the missing word would hang heavy in the air. Jonah. Children learned not from lessons but from glances, from pauses, from the way their elders' eyes turned distant when lanterns trembled in the wind. The story was not told, it was lived, carried in silence, sharpened into myth. The newspapers had forgotten him. They buried the story beneath other scandals, other crimes, reducing it to a curiosity, a mystery without answer. But the silence of Jonah did not need print. It grew in the shadows where truth survives, in whispers that defy erasure. His act no longer belonged to him alone. It had become a legend that stretched beyond Mississippi, beyond 18 and into the marrow of history itself. In the legend, the knife was not steel but justice itself, honed across generations of silence. The lanterns were not decorations but witnesses, trembling in their cages of glass. The master's throat was not flesh but a ledger signed in red, a final account settled by silence. And so Jonah of Mississippi became something larger than flesh and bone. He became the silence that breaks, the ledger that balances, the shadow that endures. His act could not be confined to one Christmas Eve. It rippled outward, reshaping memory, haunting every corner where power thought it safe. On winter nights, when the wind howls through the fields and lanterns sway against the frost, some still claim they hear him. Not footsteps, not breath, but silence itself, heavy, pressing, reminding. Silence that waits, silence that remembers, silence that speaks without sound. The story has no end because silence has no end. The ledger remains unfinished, the echo remains. Jonah's act is not only history, it is legend, it is myth. It is the haunting truth that beneath the Christmas lanterns of 1818, silence slit the throat of cruelty, and silence still walks among us.